Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. We're glad that you can join us today for this webinar. We are joined today with Professor Doron Shultziner, who will be talking about the movement against democratic backsliding in Israel. We've seen quite a remarkable explosion, it would appear on the outside, social explosion of people taking to the streets. And we're looking forward to hearing from you your analysis of how this has been happening contextually, but also on an organizing level, and what effect this is having in society. Our presenter today is Professor Doron Shultziner. He received his bachelor's from the Political Science Department and the Middle Eastern Studies Department in the Hebrew University, and his MA from the Political Science Department at the Hebrew University. He received his PhD from the Politics and International Relations Department at the University of Oxford. Later, he worked as a postdoctoral fellow and visiting lecturer at Emory University. He returned to Israel in 2009 and worked as a postdoctoral fellow until 2012. He then became the academic director of an Israeli think tank for Zionist, democratic, and liberal thought. Professor Shultziner joined the Politics and Communication Department at Hadassah Academic College in 2014. His main areas of research are democracy and democratization, politics and law, theories of social movements, media coverage of protest activity, and partisan media bias, as well as multidisciplinary approaches to political behavior. Professor Shultziner is the head of the Politics and Communication Department at Hadassah Academic College, Jerusalem, since 2018. He is also one of the founders of Mali's Center for Enterprising Citizens, a nonprofit that advances social entrepreneurship. Doron, we're so glad to have you here today. I'm going to invite you to share your screen, and we're looking forward to learning from what you are seeing happen in Israel these days.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and thank you to the ICNC for inviting me to share these lessons from Israel. It's an honor for me to participate in ICNC event. It's an organization that I got to know back in my PhD days, and I really honor and respect its work, very important work around the world. So again, a pleasure. I'm here to share my experience to this growing body of knowledge that is accumulated in ICNC about civil resistance, sharing our experience from Israel over the several months. It may be called the movement against democratic backsliding in Israel, part of a general, global phenomena of democratic backsliding in other countries, such as in Hungary and Poland, two countries that have been mentioned quite a lot in the Israeli parlance over the past several months. So I'm going to go over what has happened here with a focus on the main lessons, at least from my perspective, on why civil resistance was successful, at least until now, in halting democratic backsliding, although obviously this hasn't ended yet and we're in the midst of this struggle, and yet it's important to stop for a second and to think of what has happened, and happened in a good way in terms of civil resistance and social movement. So very briefly, and without getting into the details of and the particulars of the judicial overall, the origins of this mass movement start on January 4th. It's about a week after this new government, old new government, was sworn in. I say all new because it's a new government for Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's his sixth government, and it was established anew with a very right-wing composition. And about a week after, the Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, announced his first phase of a judicial overhaul, which is basically a regime change in Israel. It would considerably, remarkably, even radically change the constitutional arrangements in Israel and almost eliminate the only checks and balances that exist over over the government and over parliament, and that is the Supreme Court. And once these plans have come to be known, many Israelis were really frightened, angry, morally shocked over what is going to happen. And that was the fuel for mass mobilization that begins afterwards. And mass mobilization took on several forms. The first form, already several days afterwards, if the speech was on January 4th, then here you already see the first big demonstration in Tel Aviv with several tens of thousands of people gathering in the Habima Square. And that marks one of the main aspects of the struggle against the government and its plans, in the sense of this weekly mass demonstrations that showcase the size and the growing size of opposition and resistance to the government plans. They started with several tens of thousands of people each week, and they grew. By March, they grew to hundreds of thousands of Israelis taking to the streets, mainly in Tel Aviv, in the Kaplan-Begin intersection that you see over here in the left-hand side where my mouse hovers. There were also two big demonstrations in Jerusalem, very big considering the size of the population, about 100,000 demonstrators in Jerusalem twice. And these demonstrations, in fact, haven't stopped. They continued even after, as you can see, even after the judicial overhaul was halted. So this was one main way, a vehicle to showcase the resistance and to exert pressures, political pressures against the government. But aside from these mass demonstrations, protesters were constantly seeking ways to figure out how to exert pressure also between these big Saturday mass events. And we're thinking of other ways, even more radical ways to apply pressure. And by the beginning of February, this new strategy has crystallized into what we call disruption days, or days of rage, or national disruption days. They come with all sorts of names, but they all mean the same thing, in the sense that during weekdays, various acts of protests were joined together into what was framed a national protest day. And that was interesting, and it took some time to come up with this idea, although now it looks very perhaps banal or ordinary. But at the beginning, people were initiating all sorts of protests that we have very little time to talk about all of them, but really many innovative forms of protest, from local protest to national protest to digital protest and so on. And then eventually the headquarters, on which I will speak about shortly, decided to bring all these together and saying, let's coordinate all this into a single day. Let's call it a national disruption day. And that allowed all these different groups, local groups in different cities, different initiatives within different cities, to say, okay, we're coordinating our actions for this highlight day. And so you see here only a few of these disruption actions. This is the blockage of the central road leading to Jerusalem, between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And this is a relatively small group of less than 100 demonstrators that came here. They were not coordinated, as far as I know, with the other protests, and they decided that their protest for the morning was to block the main road. They brought some equipment with them, as you can see. Others decided to disrupt the trains. Others came to the airport, trying to disrupt the airport, especially when Netanyahu was going about his flights to Europe. Blockages of many of them of roads in various cities. And that proved to be a very important way to apply pressure, because other than the mass protests on Saturdays, they enable people at least once, sometimes even twice or more during the week to have these big events. They were also coordinated around specific legislative moves that the coalition was holding in parliament, in the Israeli Knesset. And so these disruption days were often around such events, trying to disrupt the work of parliament, although obviously in a non-violent and legal way, and in all sorts of ways that came to the national attention of the news. And that was the advantage, in the sense that each protest alone would not garner a lot of media attention, but all of this together got a lot of media attention and brought in more and more protesters to join, and more opportunities to join it. Much of the protests were helped by WhatsApp groups. That was probably the main media platform to organize protest activity. You see a few of the groups that I signed up for to get information. They were used to gather information, support, and of course to coordinate protest activities. Some of them were not protest activities in themselves, but more coordinating activities and so on. But that was very important. And the way that these groups emerged was through mainly existing social and professional networks. So, for example, towns and neighborhoods and small cities that already have a WhatsApp group. So someone within the group would call the participant to join a new group only for those who oppose the judicial overhaul. And that in that way, so many groups were formed and coordinated all across Israel. And in addition to that, many umbrella groups were formed to coordinate all these other groups. So we have hundreds, if not thousands, of groups, WhatsApp groups, all constantly working and talking about protests. So that was an important element. So given this overview, I want to speak about 6 key factors that I consider to be the most important in confronting the judicial overhaul and in eventually stopping the process. Although, again, as I said, it could be renewed, we don't know. But as I will argue at the end of my presentation, the chances that what they try to do will continue in the same way is, I think, very small. But let's start and highlighting the key factors that were important here. So the first factor is the resistance headquarters. As I argued, the protest was very dispersed and included many local networks and groups across Israel. There was eventually a headquarters that was formed that managed to form and to bring in some, obviously not all, of the representatives of these various groups. So they included about 30 some representatives who also separated into these different working groups within this larger headquarters. At the head of these headquarters, there's this a team of really high profile and high human capital professionals, including former chief of staff here, Dan Chalutz, two former members of the government, not politicians, but chief of staff, Orni Petrushka, a famous philanthropist and entrepreneur from the high-tech industry. And what they managed to do is to use the most sophisticated tools that one can think of, from using digital tool, media tools, to organizing donations from, as you can see, over 40,000 Israeli protest donors contributed over 20 million shekels, which they handle in order to fund, among other things, the big demonstrations in Tel Aviv and the equipment and flags and so on. And to use polls and panels to understand where public opinion is going and how the public responds to the various actions each week. So it was a really simple yet very sophisticated way of organizing the protest, not in saying you should do this and this group should do that, but enabling this overall structure that was really about coordination among the various groups. The second key factor here are direct political pressures that protesters exerted against certain politicians, specifically politicians from the Likud party, the party of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the members of parliament who were considered to be more moderate or more amenable to this pressure, and that were willing to compromise more, and that were more afraid of civil war and all these concepts that we got to talk about in the last 4 months. So here we see various groups, again, local groups targeting, for example, the defense minister Gallant, who will be very important in this story eventually. So they come to him during his morning practice, sports practice in the sea, and they wave the flag to him. They came up to his house, but not only to his house, to about a dozen member of Knesset, member of parliament, who were considered to be serious targets that can stop the judicial overall. So they came to the Minister Dichter. They shouted down certain ministers. So it became really difficult for these members of parliament to go in public and to hang around without being shouted down or being talked to. So there was all these forms of direct pressure that were important. Thirdly, very important here were pressures by army veterans and reserve service soldiers. I won't go into detail in how the IDF works, but basically it depends to a large extent on reserve service. And once this movement, and more specifically judicial overall, started to kick in, many members of the army, both within the regular ranks and especially the reserve service duty, said that they will stop volunteering and coming to reserve service if this is not stopped. And that became a real headache and a real issue for the defense minister, and more broadly to the to the Ministry of Defense, because as you will see at the end, in many respects, that was the major factor that forced the Minister of Defense to step against the judicial overall and speak against it. So this group was very important. Another important element here was the involvement of experts. We had over 20,000 experts, professionals, academics, jurists, lawyers, economists, political scientists, and more that came against the government and its plans for the judicial overall. Over 80 groups of experts, each separately gathered and issued statements, public statements against the implications and repercussions of the judicial overall. Especially important were jurists and economists who explained that this will bring a serious backsliding to the Israeli economy, talking about investments that will go out from Israel. In fact, it already started at that time. And jurists and political scientists who explained that what the government is pursuing looks nothing like a regular liberal democracy. And despite the fact that the government is saying that this will only democratize Israel, they were very important in refuting this, both internally and, as you can see, also externally by academics outside of Israel who warned against the government. That was important in helping public opinion turn against this overall as well. Media coverage was very important, aside from the fact that these matters were obviously covered to a large extent. The media did take this very seriously in devoting not just time but in-depth analysis that I heard both on the radio and on television, and of course in print, of what this means, of helping the public to understand the judicial and constitutional system of Israel, what exists and what these changes would mean. So we really had, I would say, a commendable, good public discussion in Israel that enabled the public to realize that the government is trying to concentrate too much power in its hands. The media also issued its own public opinion polls for and against it. As you can see, the against was rising, namely public opinion against the government. International media also helped, by the way, in asking Netanyahu a difficult question. He doesn't give interviews to the Israeli news except for the right-wing channel 14. So that was important as well. Also in giving analysis of the number of demonstrators in various demonstrations. So media coverage was very important. I'm kind of rushing forward to trying to keep up with the time limits. Also important were international players and international pressure. Netanyahu went to several visits abroad, especially in Europe, and was criticized first by Emmanuel Macron of France, saying that he hopes Netanyahu remembers that this coalition and this friendship is built on mutual values, democratic values. Same thing came from Germany and from England and from the European Union. And of course, very important were also pressures from the United States, first from United States Secretary Blinken, and then from President Biden himself, criticizing Netanyahu, warning him both privately and then publicly, saying that he's not welcomed in the United States until this thing is off the table, and so on. So this brings us to these factors brings us to the latter part, and that is the outcome or the outcomes. There are two main outcomes of this. So these pressures were mounting and mounting towards the end of March, and at that week, the week of March 26, beginning of March 26, the government was, the coalition rather, was planning to pass part of its constitutional changes. I should say that at this point already, the pressures were so formidable, and the government was already seeking some compromise and legitimacy from the opposition, that he took off the table several of the proposed bills. But of course, it did not stop, and it wanted to have some gains, or to have some of the bills passed, and they were actually very important ones. So leading up to this point, to that week, that was the height of these pressures. And the first one to cave in, or to yield to the pressures, was surprisingly the defense minister that I mentioned beforehand. The first minister, Yoav Gallant, here on the right-hand side. And on the evening of March 25th, he came to the media. Again, I'm cutting a longer story short. Before that, Netanyahu told him not to speak, and he decided to postpone it. In any case, on March 25th, he came to the media saying that this must be stopped, that this poses a clear, immediate, and real danger to the security of the state, and that he, as Minister of Defense, cannot stand silent to what's going on. So many people were obviously on the opposition were saying, this is what we were saying all along, and so on. So finally, someone who agreed with us. Netanyahu was at that point still abroad. He came back to Israel on the day after, on Sunday, and then he sacked Yoav Gallant. He fired him on the evening of March 26. That was late in the evening, by the way, and about 9 p.m. And people were, again, shocked, morally shocked, very angry, and tens of thousands of demonstrators, many of them new demonstrators, by the way. It was the first time that they demonstrated. It came to mainly to Tel Aviv. They blocked the Ayalon highways, and that became a real tenacious, hot night between them and the police, although it was non-violent, but they completely blocked the interstate. The next morning, it was clear to everyone that something dramatic has happened, both by the fact that he fired the Minister of Defense Gallant for simply speaking his mind, and over what has happened during the night. Everyone was surprised. I remember I was very surprised that something so dramatic has happened over the night. And so the next morning on March 27, there was a huge demonstrations of about 100,000 people near the Knesset. Alongside, there were organized labor strikes, and also private companies called on strikes. The airport workers also declared a strike, and the airport, the national airport, was shut down for several hours. And all this led to this dramatic climax on March 27, which was also obviously called by that time a day of rage, and was called to be a day of rage, and everyone was rushing to Jerusalem, a very dramatic day. And only at 8 p.m., after everyone awaits to see what Netanyahu will say, eventually Netanyahu says that he's halting the bills, and by the end of that week, the Knesset went on recession, and they only now came back from that recession. So we had about a month of rest, so to speak. So two major outcomes. One, obviously, the political outcome of stopping the bills, or at least halting them for now. And the second one, which is not less important, is the shift in public opinion. So you can see that by the end of March, public opinion to the left was completely against it, but also among central voters, you can see the majority against it. And even among right-wing voters, you can see that over a third of the voters on the right oppose the judicial overall. They oppose the government. Many of them voted for it. Even more important is the polls asking people about what they will vote if election is to be held today. So you can see that Netanyahu's party declined to only 20 seats. They have 32 seats, if I remember correctly, right now. So they become the third largest party, and two parties are bigger than the Likud, specifically Gantz's party, which has about 28, 30 seats, and the whole right-wing coalition collapses to only 46 seats, whereas the opposition gains the majority, and that's quite dramatic. We have to remember that that elections were only held 4 months ago, 5 months ago, and that public opinion shifted so dramatically. That is a major outcome. So I think my time is up, Bruce, if I'm correct. You gave me 25 minutes, and I think I'm over time. So I'll stop here, and I'll elaborate on the different topics based on the interest that the participants have.
Great. Thank you so much. That is very insightful, and I'm looking forward to seeing where this discussion goes. I want to invite our attendees. Please, you're welcome to share your questions. You can do it by raising your hand, by clicking on the raise hand button, and then we can call on you and you can ask your question live over the air. Alternatively, you could submit a question through the Q&A board, and I will read it, and our wonderful guest will elucidate these ideas for us. So I'll give you a moment to submit some questions. In the meantime, I have several questions of my own. I'll start with one while the questions are coming in. You mentioned, the expression from Minister of Defense Gallant, and how significant that is, and then the consequences he faced from that. Is his position reflective of the larger position of the security sector in the military, but also the police? How have they responded to so many people on the streets? You mentioned on the night of the March 26th that it was a hot night, but it was still nonviolent. Have they generally allowed it? How would you describe that?
Yeah, well, two good questions. They're separate because I would separate here between the defense, the Ministry of Defense, and the IDF more generally, more specifically, and the police. So from the military perspective and the defense of the Ministry of Defense, there were certainly calls that an analysis saying that this poses a real danger to Israel's security, that it creates cleavages within the army ranks, that it creates problems of motivation for people to advance in army ranks, to join the army, to remain in the army. For the IDF pilots that are a very important aspect of Israel's security, that were overwhelmingly against what was going on. In fact, many of them are also pilots for El Al, the national flight company, and they refused to fly Netanyahu abroad. It became very difficult to find pilots to fly him abroad. It became a real issue. But more seriously, yes, the army was very worried. Many army generals, both veteran and obviously within within the army ranks would talk to Gallant, and he said that when in his speech, he said that he met many people, he spoke to soldiers, and he understood that this is a real predicament, that, as he said, a real danger to Israel's security. Let's not be fooled. He's no dove and no left wing. He is a hard right winger, and if he came to say that, it means that he understood that this is a real threat to Israel's security. In fact, he publicly supported the judicial overhaul before he was a Minister of Defense. Only after he became Minister of Defense and toward the end of the period did he cave in, because he understood that this is a real danger. As to the police, very, very interesting as well, and very tricky, because the Minister of Internal Security, what we now call National Internal Security, or whatever name they came up for him, is an ultra-right nationalist who is involved in constantly fighting with the police and trying to force them to clamp down on protesters, whereas the let's say the professional police ranks are trying to maintain both, law and order, but also to enable people to protest. So they constantly kind of walk a fine line where the minister says, stop them from blocking roads. And obviously they need to allow people to use the roads, especially the highways, so they people cannot block them indefinitely. On the other hand, they want to allow spontaneous demonstrations and protests and more generally. So I think they did a fine job in trying to strike this balance, and not trying to go into fights with the protests. Obviously, there were here and there were some fights, but generally I think the police handled it wisely and allowed both. So I hope I answered
Yes.
both questions.
Yes. We have several questions coming in that have been typed. Doron, one of our questions is from Matt Evans, who writes, civil resistance scholars talk about how protesters engaged in nonviolent disruption can challenge and change the interests of the elites that lead these pillars of support, which help uphold the power of the government. Do we see any of these elites making public statements in response to these protests, or shifting their interests away from government support?
Yes, absolutely. Especially, again, several groups. I wouldn't call them interest groups, but okay, you if you want, you can call them interest groups. Both from the economy. There were, I think, one of the first, again, groups. It's like very to generalize, but at least from within the economy and the private market, there were some important players coming against this, some earlier than others, warning against the implications, warning against the investments going out, some of them publicly saying that they're taking money outside of Israel because Israel is now becoming unstable politically, and therefore they cannot keep the money here, as they would take it out of any country that becomes politically unstable. So this group was very important. I wouldn't say that let's say the other experts, especially the academic scholars, are an interest group that really threaten the government, because they're, in any case, they're portrayed to be left-wing and anti-government and leftist and so on. But certainly many people, also right-wing scholars, came against the government. And I think that they could not just say, oh, well, they're all just leftist, although obviously some of them did say that. But I think that deep inside, they knew, well, I know this guy is a right-winger and he's coming against. And so, yeah, some of these groups did come against the government, saying how dangerous this would be, calling for a compromise, saying that they're rushing it, saying that they're trumping over the opposition, and all sorts of criticism. So, Matt, yes, I think in many respects it is true. I'm probably forgetting about other groups right now. But as I mentioned, for example, people who serve in a reserve service, they're a very important group in Israel. They did not see themselves as a group, and they were not in contact in that way. But all this brought them together, and they started acting as a group, saying, the social contract has been broken. We have been serving this country on the basis that this is a liberal democracy and that we have these shared values. Now that you take this away, we are not going to continue playing our part, and because the contract has been broken, and we would not serve a dictatorship or a non-democratic country, and that led to even a radicalization, not only in these sectors, but in other sectors of Israeli society that have said, we're fed up with the current situation. We've been working too hard and carrying this country economically and military over our shoulders. And now people who do not serve in the military are trying to dictate a change in the regime. So that was very important as well.
We have a question from Nonviolence International. Can you talk more specifically about the role and impact of labor unions? Which unions have had more impact and which less? And could you speak to why potentially?
So labor unions were important on this final day that I mentioned on March 27th. I think only then they came to be important. Many people wanted the labor unions. We have, by the way, a national labor union that organizes most of organized labor, not all of it, but most of organized labor. The Histadrut, it's an organization that predates the state of Israel. And if it calls a national strike, then that means that most of the economy is in a shutdown. Also, most of the state organizations are also under this organization. So they were important only on the last day when the chairman of this organization called on a strike. It was important, but I wouldn't say that it was the most important thing. It added to this drama on March 27. But there were other things that were important that way on that day. So it's important, but I wouldn't overestimate or overemphasize its importance. Certainly not during the long stretch of these 3 months of protests. That wasn't there weren't any strikes leading to that point.
I see. That's helpful. Thank you. We have two questions which sort of complement each other. One anonymous participant writes, how participative were the protests and did they include minority groups? And complementary to that, Steve Chase writes, has the opposition to the government built any alliances with Israeli Palestinians, which make up 20% of the population inside the Green Line? If not, is this a missed opportunity? And how could the demands be reframed to include their grievances and concerns?
Yes, that's also very good questions, and they were obviously discussed here. Where are the Israeli Arabs? Okay, why are they not protesting? So first of all, there were obviously some Israeli Arabs protesting, and also they came to speak as keynote speakers in the big demonstrations. There was certainly will and also efforts to bring in Arab Israelis from within the Green Line to participate in these demonstrations. There were some successes, but again, small successes. Unfortunately, Israeli Arabs did not join this en masse. And there were obviously media analysis asking why. Some of them said, this is an internal Jewish affair. This has nothing to do with us. We don't have enough trust in state institutions to begin with. The Supreme Court has failed us in the past, and so on and so forth. In addition, we have to remember that, as you can see in the pictures, the demonstrations were filled with Israeli flags, of the Zionist movement, of the Israeli flag. At the beginning, there were demonstrators, Jewish demonstrators, by the way, most of them, that came with Palestinian flags, and it became an issue between some of the protesters, but mostly for the media, saying, especially right-wing media and the right-wing politicians, saying, look, this is a radical leftist pro-Palestinian protest. Why would you want to join it? And that would become even more difficult to right-wing protesters who did join the protest. So yes, there was an issue here over the Arab-Israeli public. There were efforts. I know that, for example, students that I've talked to asked, how can we bring the Arab students into this? And I say, you should figure this out. I mean, everyone's trying to figure out how to bring them in. So there was certainly room, and there is still room to form larger coalitions with the Israeli Arabs. And I think they have every reason, by the way, to join this, to struggle. It's in their interest. I think that the first one to feel the negative implications would be Arab Israelis, because they will be the first one to feel the legislation that will bar Arab Israelis, for example, for running to parliament and so on. So yeah, I think it's a missed opportunity, although I'm not sure who is to blame here, if there is anyone to blame here. So I hope this answers the question.
Yes. Anything else that you can speak on with other minorities, any Druze or other minorities within the Israeli community? Or is this still very much a Jewish?
The LGBT minority was very important also. Two groups that were very important. The LGBT community that, again, has a lot to lose from these moves, and sees the government as an anti-LGBT community, and they're actually quite outspoken about it. And again, we don't have time to detail all the moves that they want to advance against LGBT citizens. So they were very active in the movement. And the second group, not a minority, but has characteristics, unfortunately, of a minority, are women. Women were very important in this movement, taking positions of leadership, leading various local protests, both in front of politicians' houses and other local protests, organizing protests in different cities. Many speakers in the main stages in Tel Aviv and elsewhere, and all across Israel, are women. Women were really leading this, and there was also a specific women's group, maybe you have seen it, wearing these red dresses and head covers from this famous book and TV series. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I haven't watched it, but the idea is that, this post-apocalyptic movie where women have subordinate positions, and they dressed up to be as such, and they dramatized it in a very good way for the protest, and so it became a real discussion in Israel. So women, LGBT, these were two minority groups that were important here.
Right, thank you. You've mentioned the important role of military reservists in this resistance. Do you think their political consciousness will have spillover effects into other issues like anti-militarism or the actions of the military in the West Bank and Gaza Strip?
It's hard to say, but I can say that it has led, as movements do, they lead to radicalization of participants in all sorts of aspects. So yes, in some respect, there is more criticism now over what goes on in the occupied territories of the now West Bank, mainly in Eastern Jerusalem. I think it has spilled over in a way. There were groups, it relates to a previous question about the West Bank. There are groups within this larger movement that have brought in the message that there is no democracy with occupation. So we see these signs within this movement, and they've managed to, I think, achieve more favorable attitudes from participants who are now more willing to speak about the West Bank and the occupation and saying that these things are tied. But again, I wouldn't exaggerate and say that the majority of the participants are now becoming a peace now, activists. Yeah. But yes, there has been some movement towards this idea.
Okay, so I have a question that follows up on that, with the idea of shifts. With the shift in the right wing, that's quite significant. And what do you attribute that to? Is it if there was a large group of people on the right wing who supported this initiative in the first place, is it a case of Brexit where they get the opportunity to understand ahead of time because of the way the media was covering how it might unfold, or is there something else at play here?
Well, I would say that most voters did not know that that this would be the first thing that the government would do. Certainly not to this extent. There were actually, again, public opinion polls asking right-wing voters, did you know that that the government would do this? And if you look at the election campaign and the issues, this was not, it's not that it was completely absent, but this was not the major issue. The major issue of the elections were living costs, security aspects, certainly not this a charge against the Supreme Court and the changing of so many laws. By the way, it's not just the Supreme Court. Again, I'm simplifying. It's also the Attorney General, and it's also legal advisors in more broadly, and political nominations, and all sorts of things that relate to the rule of law. So they came with this first phase that really surprised many people. Even right-wing voters were surprised, and some of them did not know what to make of it. Again, it's a very complex matter, because what does it mean to change the way that justices are nominated? What does it mean that they have or do not have authority to strike down laws, regular laws versus basic laws, that there will be an override clause? All these concepts were completely absent from the election campaign, and they're very difficult to grasp. So we had this crash course on constitutional politics and judicial arrangements over these past months. And when people started to understand what was going on and what they're actually trying to do, and the concentration of power, so many people only then realized that what the government is attempting to do, and say, well, actually, we don't support this. By the way, even Prime Minister Netanyahu says that he doesn't agree with, for example, the overall clause. I don't think it's a good idea. So if you don't think it's a good idea, what should the ordinary voter think about this? So we had this, many people gradually shifted away from this and saw more problems than solutions. But those that support it don't support I would say, a specific solution. They want to see this victory of the people they chose over the other camp. But that's political polarization at its best or at its worst.
Yeah. So we're coming near the end of our time here. I want to end on this question to the future. An anonymous attendee asks, what should we expect now or next?
So
If I could add, with the idea that one of the main outcomes has been the halting, right? So if it's been halted, what happens when? Is it indefinitely? Is there a date on that?
yeah,
And what do you foresee?
it's a good question. We're all asking the same thing. Currently, they said, I think they said that at least until the end of May, there are negotiations going on between members of the coalition and the opposition, and trying to reach some deal about something that is agreeable and could be legitimized by the opposition as well. Certainly, this would look very different than what the government is trying to do. It remains to be seen if they can actually strike a deal. Sometimes they say we're very, very close to reaching a deal. And this other day, the opposition say we're nowhere close and we're not going to give up on the important element. So if they strike a deal, then that's one thing. Obviously, we need to see what this deal is and if it's acceptable. The other option is that, and it's very possible that these negotiations will stop, will break down. And then the question is whether the government is going to try and push forward the legislation without consensus, and what type of legislation. It's certainly possible, but I think that even if they do push forward unilaterally their own legislation, this would not be the legislation we saw until now. It will take into consideration the criticism, perhaps some of the agreements that they've achieved. So it would not be just to resume what was halted back then on March 27.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be a good thing that they're going to come up with, but no one knows.
Okay. Well, it's helpful to see the way in which people have been organizing. The role of WhatsApp is, I find, to be really interesting, and it seems to strike a balance between a movement with leadership, right, with the four prominent elites who are highly involved, but then also it takes sort of shape of a leaderless movement where everyone is sort of initiating things on their own, starting new discussions. Is that a fair way to describe that?
Yeah, I think it's a movement that allows people to initiate, to be entrepreneurs, protest entrepreneurs. Everyone can do their own thing, online, offline, students and military veterans and academics and really various groups that are organizing separately and working in different areas, specializing in different localities and areas. So it's really impressive to see. For me, it's really a school for civil resistance. I certainly learned as a civil resistance scholar. Yeah. I certainly learned many new things from this group, from this movement, and I really in awe for what has happened here in those months.
Thank you. Well, we really appreciate you sharing what you've learned with all of us in the larger civil resistance scholarship and activist community. So thank you very much for taking the time today, this evening for you in Israel.
Pleasure to be here in ICNC.
Thank you very much. On behalf of ICNC and all of the attendees, we're grateful for what you've shared today. Thank you to all attendees for joining us. We'll be posting this video later today online for you to be able to share in your network so that more people can hear about this really insightful assessment of this movement in Israel. We wish you all a good afternoon, a good morning, a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.